Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. Right.
There
Got
we go.
it.
Live.
George Braddock is now coming in. All right. I'm about ready to hit recording. Okay. And letting in the rest of the waiting room. Lori, I'm going to pin you to the top as the facilitator. Or Heidi, I'm so sorry. All right.
No
All right,
worries.
Heidi and Stephen Dyercost, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. This is the work session to talk about the changes that the Bylaws and Elections Committee have been talking about. Stephen, let me know when you want me to share.
I'm still getting ready. Okay. Yeah, I guess we should just probably start out by approving the agenda, and then I'll talk for a minute about how we get started. So um
So we should do announcements first.
we should do announcements, yeah.
Does anybody have any announcements? If you could raise your hand in the chat, that would be helpful.
And I just froze up, so I might need to come back.
We can still hear you. You're just not.
Okay. I just don't have any video, huh? Or not any moving video.
Okay.
I have kind of a skull on my face there. I should probably not stick with that.
So I'll go ahead and talk about the agenda. We've discussed changing it just a little bit. Instead of having membership comments right at the beginning, we're going to talk about the 5 changes that are proposed and the rationale that goes with those changes, and then we'll have membership comments and board comments, not just comments, comments and questions. And then we'll go to the next of the 5 topics that we're going to change. We're going to kind of skim over the bylaw part of the actual bylaw changes, but if we have time, we can go into them in more detail. We just got the first lawyer review about an hour ago. And so I'm going to start by sharing the 5 proposed changes and the rationale, and then I'll share the bylaws, and I can actually kind of share the lawyer's comments along with that. So what we had on the .NET site is slightly different, or going to be slightly different after the lawyer's comments. And hopefully we plan to stop at 9 o'clock sharp. So at about 8:55, we will do our meeting evaluation. The next board meeting is April 1st. And if AJ wants to get President's Piece, we'll have time for that. And we're going to stop right at 9 o'clock. Any comments or questions about the slightly changed agenda? We are going to try to keep member input to 3 minutes. And Kirsten is going to be our timer. Looks like Stephen is almost back. So I'm going to go ahead and share the proposals. I've got them open on my computer so that I can share.
So I am back. I had trouble connecting audio. My video just won't connect at all. So hopefully most of you remember what I look like.
Well, and once I share, we won't be able to see you except in a little tiny box anyway.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we are talking about changing is the method of selection of directors to election by direct ballot. My brief summary of that is that it's going to actually be more like what we actually do. When the fair started, we had a much smaller population. Elections were always in person. And then as our family spread out across the country, we started doing absentee ballots, although the state calls them proxies. And so now we really do it by direct ballot. And Stephen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the first thing I want to add is we just got our legal review back an hour ago. So we're just kind of going through the changes. There weren't too many things, but there were some language changes and some clarifications. And the first thing is that instead of calling it election by direct ballot to coincide with statute, we really need to call it action by written ballot, but it's the same thing. We just send ballots to everybody automatically, which we have been doing since the pandemic started. Prior to the pandemic, we had a permanent absentee list, which I think averaged a little over 1,000 people, maybe a little bit more than that. And basically anybody who wanted to receive a ballot in the mail, we sent them a ballot. When they signed the back of their return envelope, that was appointing the secretary as their proxy. And the secretary was actually casting the votes for them. So the only people that were voting directly were people that showed up at our annual meeting and filled out their ballot and deposited it in the ballot box. Then everybody else voted by proxy. Since we weren't having in-person annual meetings during the pandemic, our entire elections were conducted by proxy, and we want to just get rid of that proxy mechanism for the most part and just start sending everybody a ballot like we've been doing. So this is basically reflecting what we're already doing. Our proposal does allow for people to cast proxy ballots. We have people that live in other countries that don't have time to return their ballots in time, people that spoil their ballots, people that make last minute changes. We're still keeping the mechanism for those people to appoint the secretary as a proxy and cast a ballot for them if need be. So we're not getting rid of that at all, but we're just making the majority of our ballots be action by written ballot now. So that's basically what this change is. It shouldn't be, it's not really going to impact people. You're not going to notice any difference other than some of the language on the back of your ballot when you get it. But other than that, it's just going to be conducting elections as we've been for the last several years. Thanks.
I'm not sure I can see the chat when I'm sharing. Oh, yes, I can. So if any, so now would be the time for member comment on this one
Yeah.
or questions?
Yep.
And if you would put your name in the chat, that would be the best way to do it. Not seeing any member comments at this point. If there's any board comments or questions. Well, then let's go ahead and move on.
Before we go further, and maybe you said this while I was trying to reconnect, but I just want to clarify tonight, we're just presenting these options to the membership and the board and discussing them and taking feedback. We're going to have a meeting of our committee, our joint committee, next Monday night where we'll finalize the proposals. There will be a new business in May and voted on in June. So there'll be a lot of opportunities for more feedback from members and board members between now and then. Right now, we're just trying to present things to people and get other ideas from folks. Thanks.
AJ, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I was just wondering with this change, how many ballots would you say would you imagine would be done by proxy with this change? Would there be a decrease in that, or
yeah, it would be
staying the same?
Right now, we're doing approximately 2,000 ballots by proxy. And after this change, we'll be doing maybe 5. But we will still be sending the same number of ballots to people as we have been. It's just right now, every single ballot is a proxy or requires a proxy.
Okay.
Yeah, I should also point out on this, and if we ever want to move to online voting or some type of electronic voting, we would need to make this kind of a change. Because if we kept our current system where people are elected at the annual membership meeting, if somebody wanted to vote online, they would actually have to submit a written proxy authorization to the secretary ahead of time and then the secretary would have to vote for them online as a proxy. And if we change to a action by written ballot, then the board can decide at some point that voting online is a form of written ballot, and they wouldn't have to fill out the proxy form. So this is a real important change for us looking forward if we decide to go to online voting.
And I have a quick follow-up.
Go ahead.
Was there anything feedback from the attorneys regarding this portion?
Only changing the language from direct ballot to action by written ballot to conform to statute, but there was nothing else substantive from the attorney other than that.
Okay.
And keep in mind, I've had the attorney's response for an hour, so I need a little more time to digest it, but I did take a look through it before this meeting.
Okay, I'm guessing that I've got a helper here. I'm guessing that there may be a little bit more questions or comments about the next one, which is to establish a minimum age for membership. Currently, we use the wristband for who gets a wristband as the member, so it puts us at about age 14. And it would really clarify things and make it easier for Stephen if we had an actual membership age. We've worked on this off and on for several years. We did a survey. I can't remember what year it was. Maybe you do, Stephen.
2018, I think.
18, that's what I was thinking. And we got a lot of feedback. There was a lot of support, or some support, for like making it age 13 or 14. A lot of support for age 18, which is the normal voting age. But there was also a lot of support for age 16. And Stephen has some good rationale for that, and research that he found about allowing voters to start at age 16.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, when you did that survey in 2018, the plurality wanted 18 to be the voting age, but the majority wanted less than 18, either 16, 14, or even younger. So it seemed like the results of that survey were that they wanted to lower the voting age. I did some research into this. I looked into national elections. 2 European countries were the first 2 in the world to lower their voting age to 16. That was Austria in 2007 and Scotland in, I think, 2012. I'm not positive. I think that's when Scotland did it. So it hasn't been all that long ago, but there were some studies done in Austria after that. And what they found was that people who started voting at age 16 tend to be more consistent long-term voters than people that start voting at age 18. And when they did the studies on that, there's no conclusive evidence as to why yet, because it hasn't been all that long. But the thinking was that because people at age 16 are in a more stable family environment generally than people at 18 who are going to college, getting married, getting jobs, changing their lives majorly, that instilling that habit in them at age 16 is a little bit easier, and they tend to be more consistent after that. So I was thinking that would be a good age because of that. And then I started looking into psychological studies, trying to figure out, and I'm not a psychologist and I haven't taken a psychology class in close to 40 years now, but I understand some of the basic concepts. And there have been some studies done on cognitive development. One really interesting one was to ask people at age 16 what they want from their elected officials, what their values are, and then ask them whom they would vote for, and to correlate how closely the candidates they would vote for would be reflective of their values. And they found there was a pretty strong correlation there, that at age 16, people did have the amount of cognitive development to be able to make those types of informed choices. Younger than 16, that started falling off fairly quickly. So we need some age. We need some voting age, and it needs to not be attached to the wristband age, because the wristband age could change at any time or go away completely. So I'm proposing 16 because of the research that I did, and I'd love to hear what other people have to think about it. Thanks.
And the committees were generally in support of age 16.
Yeah, the committee supports that as well.
So this would be the time for membership comments or questions. Please put your name in the chat or your hand in the chat. Your name will already be there. Well, I wait to see if anybody puts their hand up. I'll just say that I like 16 because we're the fair and we shouldn't necessarily go along with what the national age is. And one of the things that, one of the comments that came up a lot in the survey was maybe younger, but only if they were working, not if they were just there as a teen with their parents, but only if they were working. And that would be a little bit harder to track for us. So let's go ahead and go to board comments or questions. John?
Hi. Yeah, on one hand, I would really like to see a younger voting age, but as one of the things about the fair is that we're a unique population, and a lot of studies of the outside world don't really have much bearing. Having been assisting Teen Crew for 15 years and looking at how hard it is to get teams to actually show up where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be, or having teams graduate from Teen Crew and actually be willing to work an adult job as opposed to just getting a wristband. It makes me concerned that in our population, maybe going with 16, people aren't going to be informed enough to be good voters. Getting a large number of votes to me is less important than having a smaller number of informed voters. I would say that I would probably be in favor of allowing younger people to vote if they were actually volunteering as opposed to just showing up, because then they would at least know something about the fair. And that's actually pretty easy for us to track these days, so that's not an issue. That's it.
Thank you. Teresa?
So yeah, I'm on the committee, and when we had the discussion, I began the discussion really wanting to stick with 18. I'm a middle school teacher, so my life has been with 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds, and I love them and I have a lot of respect for them. And I was really moved by the research that it upped the long-term voting, and that I think is so important and such a great gift that we can give the rest of the world to get these kids voting more, because as we all know, that's important. So I'm in support of the 16. I wouldn't oppose if it was lower, but I think 16 seems like a pretty reasonable research-based number.
Thank you. AJ?
I like 16. However, I would like to propose an exception, if you will, for anyone who signs up for Teen Crew. I think it is a way for us to get young folks excited about joining and working at the fair. And I think it also encourages those 14 and 15-year-olds who do sign up for a team, or I think you have to be 15 or something to sign up. It encourages them to start learning the process. I think it's 14. Yeah, there we go, John. I do, having been a teacher for a good part of my career, I do want to recognize that there's not much that people mature differently at different ages. And so you may have a 15 or a 14-year-old who has been a part of the fair for their whole entire lives, and have life experiences that would have them be as mature, if not more mature, than a 16-year-old. And so, without getting into the weeds about things, I'd like to support the 16-year-old age, but I also think we can encourage those 14 and 15-year-olds by saying, if you join the teen crew, that is a way to get your ballot earlier than 16.
Oops. Thank you. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, just to respond to that, I'd like to see a hard-coded age in the bylaws. I think that would be the cleanest way to handle things. And I understand the concern about the teen crew. This is something I mentioned to you, AJ, and I mentioned to a couple other people so far that as well. And I'm not ready to propose this officially yet, but I think the idea of having a non-voting representative from the teen crew on the board might be a way to get them involved more with the organization as well. So that might be another thought that we have on that. As far as saying anybody on team crew is eligible to vote, then either we need to put something in the bylaws defining what the ages are for a team crew member, or we're setting voting qualifications that aren't embedded in the bylaws. And a big part of what we're trying to do here is having all the qualifications to be a voting member embedded in the bylaws somehow. So, we can add something about teen crew to the bylaws, I suppose, or we might think about having a non-voting representative eventually on the board. So those are my thoughts there. Thanks.
Thank you. I guess I would just like to point out that teen crew has been able to sign up as members for many years. And I don't think that I would have to do a little bit of research to really find out what the numbers are, but I don't think that there has been a strong showing of teen crew signing up. And if they do sign up, also not a strong return on voting.
Yeah, I think it's a handful that sign up every year. Maybe a dozen. Not too many.
So if I don't see any other hands, let's go ahead and move on to.
I did raise my hand again.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, we have a handful of our members that actually vote, adult members that vote. So I don't think we can use that as a way to discourage the few team crew folks that do sign up to do that. And I don't think it is a major inconvenience. We talk a lot about us being a unique organization. And I don't think there's deficit to having an exception like that for the teen crew. And I have not heard a reason why that would be a significant deficit to how we do things. And I think it has a positive effect. And I think as an organization, we're trying to appeal to a younger group of folks. And I'd rather us keep the doors open than to shut the doors on their active participation in our processes.
And I said what I said, not to in any way discourage them. I was just trying to point out the history. So if there aren't any other comments, let's go ahead and move on to number 3.
I have another comment.
Oh, go ahead, Stephen.
And I want to say too, I was not meaning to discourage. I hope it wasn't taken as my discouraging teen crew members from signing up to vote. But we have a joint committee meeting next week to finalize our proposals for the board. And I'll bring this up at the meeting to see if we can find a clean way to add that teen crew eligibility to the bylaws in some way that's fairly maintainable. And we'll present that as an option to the board, as well as just the straight 16. So if the rest of the committee goes along with it, we'll present the board with two options. Thanks.
So number 3 is to clarify. Oh, John Alexander, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to voice agreement with AJ and others that encouraging turnout from our younger folks is a great thing for the organization, and I think it's a cool opportunity. It's interesting that you can yeah, whatever. I think it's a great idea to get teens voting. Thanks.
Thank you. So number 3 is about clarifying the election certification process. And when the new term would be effective, when the new directors would start. Our tradition is that at the first board meeting after an election, the old board would approve the minutes of the previous meeting, certify the election, and then the new directors would be seated. It's also, oh, I'm forgetting the words now. But that has been our practice. And there is even some disagreement or separate opinions on this one. So Stephen, could you explain the two possibilities?
Sure. And first of all, I'll explain what the reality is, which I found out from our attorney when we had our member action last year, that because statute is silent on when the terms of office begin, and because our bylaws are silent on when the terms of office begin, the term of office actually begins at the election. The date and the time that the ballots are due, before the ballots are counted and processed, that's when the new term of office actually begins. That's not what we have traditionally done. We've had a ceremonial seating of the new members at the next board meeting, but legally that's when the term of office begins. And when I found that out, I realized that we probably need to address this in our bylaws, because I don't think anybody wants the term of office to begin at the time the ballots are due before we've even counted them. So we're making a proposal to basically follow our tradition there's two things that we're looking at doing. First of all, officially certifying the election, where the secretary, along with the treasurer, would officially certify the election when the ballots are counted, which is what we have been doing for many, many years. Once the election is certified, the board would then ratify the election at the next meeting, and upon ratification, the new members would be seated. That codifies our tradition. The other option, and it's unfortunate Arna wasn't here tonight because she proposed the other option, and she'll want to discuss that at when the board discusses this, is to have the terms of office begin upon certification, which in our proposal will be within 5 days after the ballots are due. Generally, we certify on the next day, but we want to have 5 days in case there's some kind of an issue, if there's a tie, if there's some ballots that may be potentially spoiled or in question. We want to have a few days to look that over and resolve any problems. So we're looking at proposing a motion to codify our tradition, and then proposing an amendment to that motion that would actually change the beginning of the terms to when the election is certified. So those are the two options, and we want to recommend both to the board and let the board decide what they want to do. Thanks.
So any member comments or questions about this one? Go ahead, Diane.
Yeah, if we do it, if we keep the way we've been doing it, that means when the minutes are approved by the people who are there. If we change it, who approves the minutes?
The new board would approve the minutes.
But they weren't there necessarily.
Yeah, and that could be an issue with certifying it earlier. That's something that needs further discussion, I think. And before we get into more member input, there's one other thing I'm sorry I forgot to mention. The question has arisen: what if the board needs to take some action in between the time of the election and the time of certification, or when the next board meets, and specifically, there are questions about the board retreat where there are issues of confidentiality. And that's actually several people have brought that up. We have that problem right now. We have that problem in that legally newly elected members are board members at the retreat, and outgoing board members who also attend the retreat are not board members anymore. And however we decide to do it, the certification or the ratification at the next board meeting, either the new board members or the outgoing members are not going to be board members anymore. And the solution to that is, however we decide to do it, have those people who are no longer board members that go to retreat sign a confidentiality agreement when they go to the retreat. And that's a policy issue that the board can pass. It's not a bylaw issue, but that addresses that problem. The minutes, I'm not sure how to address that. I think that new board members could vote on the minutes, but they would have to review the meeting in order to make an informed vote on the minutes. There should be a quorum at any board meeting, and a quorum consisting of old board members, because normally we only replace a third of the board members. So it could be that just the old board members who are there could vote on it and potentially pass the minutes. I'm not sure, but that's a technical issue that we could address with policy, I think, as well. Thanks.
Stephen, how does it work if like the new board members abstained from approving the minutes?
If they abstained from them and there was a quorum remaining, then the old board members could approve them. And that's probably something I should put on my rules committee hat when we talk about that, and not my bylaws and elections committee hat, because that's really kind of a board rule thing. So I think what's important, though, is that we define when the term of office begins, and probably define it not when the ballots are due.
It seems counterintuitive to me to have the term start when we don't even know who they are if we haven't counted the ballots yet. So member input, comments, questions? Board input, comments, questions? Teresa?
Can you clarify what the second option is? So the first option is upon certification by the membership secretary and possibly another officer. And I was there when we discussed it, but I'm just not quite having my head around what that is.
Yeah, we've actually kind of flipped the options. We decided that the first option that we're going to present is the status quo, that at the next board meeting, the board would ratify the election and seat the members then. Then the amendment to that, the other option would be when the secretary and the treasurer certify the election results, which is generally on the days the ballots are counted, or up to 5 days after the ballots are due in case we have an issue. So those would be the two options. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
AJ?
Yeah, I am one of the ones that feel like the status quo doesn't exactly work for us, between that and the board retreat and everything that goes along with that. I would advocate for when the election is certified. I think traditions don't always serve us in the best way all the time. And what I have found in the last two elections that there's been some question about, like, how much information and when we can get that information to the new board members. They come into that first board meeting to certify, and they don't have they don't have half of the information that they need to make a vote once they are seated. And so I think there is a little bit more nuance in this decision, and I would like to see it go to once the votes are certified, I think we can create a new tradition of having outgoing board members and new board members. However you want to do it, sign a waiver or something, whatever that is. But I think we can start a new tradition where the new incoming board members are voting board members at that first meeting.
So AJ, to clarify, are you wanting the board members' terms to start at certification?
Yes.
Thank you. Stephen?
Okay, so I'm not going to take a position on either option, so I'm going to mention both options right now. Regarding when information can be exchanged with incoming board members after certification, even if the board members are not seated until the outgoing board ratifies the election, the incoming board members could sign a confidentiality agreement as soon as the election is certified, and at which point the board and staff would be free to share any confidential information with them at that point. So that doesn't have to be an obstacle if we did it at the time, at the traditional time of seating them at the next board meeting. And to address having their terms of office become effective at certification, we could always have a ceremonial passing on of the baton at the next board meeting, so we don't have to get rid of that tradition, which is not a legal thing anyways. We can continue having the old board members seated at the table with the new board members, or the old board members seated and they leave and the new board members come in upon the ceremonial ratification, if people still want to maintain that tradition. So, you know, either of those things are possible, and we don't need to have any real significant changes to make any of that happen. Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any more hands up. So I'm gonna move to number 4, which is about the voting participation requirement. The way it reads in the bylaws now, you have to have voted in the last annual election. And then we had the removal petition and another vote. And so Stephen had to remove members who had not voted for 3 years at an annual meeting who had voted at the removal petition vote. And so this just changes it so that it's any election, any vote. So that would have included them. And let me just say that Stephen and I felt really bad about those people who voted in that removal election and then had to be removed because they hadn't voted for the last 3 annual meetings.
We really did. And we tried to encourage all of them to fill out a new membership form, and some of them did and some of them didn't. But I don't want to have to deal with that anymore.
So this is a really simple change. Member comments or questions? Board comments or questions? Go ahead, Teresa.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Just like the teen conversation, any way that we can encourage voting and support that sounds like a positive to me. So to have to tell somebody, no, we don't want your vote. I mean, it just doesn't kind of goes against the things that we stand for. So I think it's a pretty simple change, but encourage voting is the key to me.
A situation like that extra vote that we had doesn't come around very often, but it did come around, and the way the bylaws were worded made it problematic. So it's just to fix that. Number 5 is about changing the petition signature requirement from a hard number to a percentage of the members voting in the last election. The bylaws were changed in the last few years to require 100 signatures. The old requirement was 25. And that was set when the membership was much smaller. So we changed it to 100 signatures, which better represented the numbers of members that we have registered. And this would change it to a percentage of the members registered. And I have a chart. Did it come up for you when I changed it to this chart?
I don't see it. I still see the bylaws.
Okay, I'm gonna have to stop sharing and change in order to change it. Stephen made a spreadsheet that shows what it would have been according to our number of voters. So 8% of last year would have been 92, 22, 104. If we go back to 2000, 8% would have been 44. And you can see that it would have been 16 back in 1990 when we started keeping track of how many people voted. And so this would change it to 8% or 100, whichever is 100 would be the minimum, right?
Yes. This would just mean we never need to change the bylaws again for petitions. However big our membership grows, it's always 8%. And that number would be provided as part of the election report every year. So at the first board meeting in November, everybody would know what that 8% number is and how many signatures they need to gather for a petition for the coming year.
And so if our membership was larger and 8% was greater than 100, the number would be higher for the petitions.
Or if our membership stays the same and a higher percentage of our members vote.
Right.
Which is what we want.
So questions or comments from membership? And Jen Lynn.
You clarified it. I misread it when I was looking at it. I thought it said just 100 for advisory, but I then reread it and you clarified it. Thank you.
Jonathan Pincus.
It just seems more understandable to me for the membership, I think, to just have a hard figure. There's a lot of variables that can change how many people vote in an election. Everything from, lack of interest in and interesting things going on, or the weather, big other things going on. I think a hard number for that particular thing is more easy for voters to understand and dependable. Thanks.
Thank you. Grumpy?
Yes, I just agree with what John just said. 100 number, and especially with that chart that you just showed of Stevens, it's going to be around that. And if the membership gets too high, then not that the membership would get too high, that number could be to get a petition done could be greater than 100, and 100 seems to be a good number for the petitions and what the knowledge that we have now about the membership. Also, I'm kind of wondering, I have a question, why 8% versus some number like 10%?
Well, I think Stephen can answer that, and he's the next hand up.
Yeah, I actually can. 8% happens to be the number of people who voted in the last gubernatorial election in Oregon that are required for a ballot measure to amend our state constitution. The threshold for amending laws is 6%, but for amending the constitution is 8%. That I initially came up with that number because that's what the state does at its higher bar level, and it seemed to kind of make sense. And then I looked at what 8% of the people that voted in the last election was, and this was in 2022, and it was just over 100. It was almost exactly what we had changed it to. But to address both Grumpy and John, I would publish the number every year as part of the annual elections report that comes out in November. That number will be on the website at all times. So anybody who is looking to circulate a petition would probably need to look up some information on our website about how to do that and the requirements for that anyway. And the number will always be there. So I don't think it's too onerous to have that number vary occasionally. And I would put it to folks that if we end up having more voters participating in our elections, then we probably want to set the bar a little bit higher for circulating petitions. If we end up having 3,000 of our members start voting, we probably want to have a few more signatures on the petitions. We have a minimum number of 100, and that's for years when we don't have really great voter participation. When we have low numbers, we still want a decent number of people to sign the petitions. So, and that wasn't part of the original proposal, but it made sense to me when that was suggested. So I think having a minimum of 100 and having a percentage, if that number goes greater than 100, makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
And the board gets to make the tough decision about whether or not they agree. Not seeing any more hands, I'll go to number 6, which is setting a time limit on a time limit to submit the required number of signatures for a petition so that it can't just keep going on for 6 or 8 or 10 months.
Hey, Heidi, I don't know if you got to the board on that last question. I was waiting for you to.
I'm so sorry. I don't think I remember to do the board either. Go ahead, AJ.
I agree with Grumpy and John on this one. I think it I think adding a math issue in there when it's not really necessary. This is one of those ones that I think we don't need this one right here. It's setting the hard number at 100. I think, and having it there for, so everybody knows and it's consistent, makes sense. And I don't want to be in the business of changing bylaws and things like that for things that like this, that it's not solving an issue that's happening right now. When you put up the chart there, I didn't see something that was so glaring that this needed to change. And so that's where I am. I want to be very, very gentle with how we make changes to our bylaws, in the future and going forward. And I don't see this one as necessary.
It did take us some 30 years to change it from 25. So.
Exactly. Thank you.
John Steinhardt.
Yeah, I think AJ pretty much said everything I was going to say. Given that we're on a no growth stance here at the moment, I really don't think we're going to be having significant changes in membership like we've had over the last few decades. So I think just leaving it simple is the best thing. Thanks.
Thank you. Stephen?
I'll just say that we are on a no growth trajectory as far as number of members. I'm hoping we're on a high growth trajectory as far as members who actually vote. And this would change if we get better member participation. And that is something I'm looking into, is ways of getting more members to be able to vote. And if we get 3,000 or 4,000 members voting, that will change, I think, the number of signatures we'll want on petitions. In my view, setting a percentage like this, that first of all, the only math that's involved is something that the secretary does in preparing the annual election report. And there's a fair amount of math that's already done in that. It's just one more equation to do. It's published. It would be a number that's published on the website throughout the year. It will not change from election until the next election. And it actually is something that would cause us not to have to revisit this in the future if we get higher voter participation. If we get 3,000 or 4,000 members voting, we still leave it at 8%, and we don't have to revisit the bylaws and change that hard number again. So this is actually simplifying things by adding this percentage. Thanks.
John Alexander?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, AJ, you did speak already, so I'm gonna let John go first.
Sounds good.
All right, I'm gonna go.
Sorry.
I think that Stephen makes a really good point. I actually, in any other organization I've ever been a part of, I've never seen bylaws be changed so often. And the more robust our bylaws can be with regards to fluctuations in numbers and whatnot, the better. And the less we go in to change bylaws, the better. The more clear they are, the better. And even though we're asking people to do a little bit of math, that I think a hard number is not appropriate considering we want a more engaged electorate. And so I just want to voice that support for what Stephen just mentioned. I think that that's spot on.
Thank you, AJ.
Yeah, I just want to go back to what you said earlier, Heidi, in that the change was 30 years in between. And so that, I mean, that is more than half of our lifetime.
Maybe 50 years. I mean, because the bylaws are probably 50 years old.
So, yeah.
Plus.
So, I mean, this was one change that's happened in that time. And so I don't see this as a significant thing. And I think every year we're hoping for more voter turnout. I know we're talking about this for at least the last 10 years. That doesn't make it always, a lot more than that, Heidi. And that doesn't always make it so. So I think one of the things, I can't imagine that all of a sudden we changed it one time in our history, and all of a sudden it's going to start changing every year. And if you have that magic antidote, if you have that magic potion, please share with us, because that would convince me that this change would be necessary.
Well, like I said before, it's going to be up to the board to decide whether they want to make this change or not. Number 6. Would set a time limit on how long it takes to get the signatures for a petition. Currently, there is no time limit. Someone could turn in a petition, and if it didn't have enough signatures, verified member signatures, they could go back and get more. But that could also carry on for a long time. And so this would put a constraint on that. And Stephen, what is the amount of time we suggested?
Well, we actually decided not to suggest this right now. What we decided in committee is that this is more of a policy issue and not a bylaw issue.
Oh, that's right.
So we're going to recommend that the board refer this to the elections committee to make a policy recommendation that the board can pass. So that should be fairly simple.
And does anyone, member or board, want to make a comment on that?
Heidi, you had John Alexander in the queue.
I think he spoke to the last one.
Yep, I'm good.
Okay.
John Pincus?
I think that if it's anything that pertains to putting something on a ballot for people to vote on, it should be described in the bylaws. I don't regard those as policy issues for the board. If you're trying to constrain the time frame in which people can raise signatures for petitioning the board, then that should be a bylaw proposal. Personally, I don't support a significant reduction in the time for that, but that's a different question. But I think it would, to me, it's not a policy issue to be decided from board to board. It should be a bylaw if it pertains to voting at all.
Thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, I won't address the bylaw versus policy issue right now. This is something that is not going to be proposed as a bylaw change to the board in this round of changes. If the board does decide that would rather have it be a bylaw change, that's something that we'll address at some later point. But I do want to address what John said about a significant reduction in the amount of time. The amount of time that people have to submit a petition right now, to submit a petition with enough valid signatures, is infinity. It is absolutely limitless. It could span board terms. It could span decades. We had a U.S. constitutional amendment that was proposed in 1793 that passed just a few years ago. It finally got ratified by enough states because there were no time limits on that constitutional amendment. That's how our petitions are right now. When we had this removal action last year, this is a question I posed to our attorney. I said, what if I don't get enough signatures on the petition? What do I tell the petitioners? And she said, well, you don't have any limits whatsoever on it. They could just keep gathering more signatures and turning in more petitions. And they can do that indefinitely until they get enough signatures to put it on the ballot. So we do need to have some kind of constraint. We either need to tell people up front, you have 6 months or a year or whatever amount of time we determine that they should have. Or we should say you get one shot at this, you turn in a stack of petitions. If you have enough, it goes on the ballot. If you don't have enough, it doesn't go on the ballot. But it's not very sustainable for us to continue allowing people to just turning in multiple copies of petitions over the course of months or years to try to get something on the ballot. What we do in our state is there is a limit. I don't recall what it is. I think it's 6 months or maybe 9 months on I don't remember what the exact limit is, but every month the petitioners turn in their petitions. They get the signatures validated and their signatures they have at that point. And the next month they can turn in another round of petitions. And as long as they get them all in by that time limit that's imposed by the state, if they have enough signatures, it goes on the ballot. So I don't know what the mechanism is that would work for us, but I think we need something other than a completely open-ended system. Thanks.
Thank you, AJ. Since you've spoken already, I'm going to let Stephen Berkson and then give you a chance again. Go ahead, Stephen Berkson.
Oh, just real quick on this issue, and I understand it's not coming before the board right now, but I guess the question is, in part, and hopefully better data systems will improve this, but the question is, in part, what is the problem with letting people gather more signatures? If they get their signatures back, could they go get more signatures and come back to submit the petition anew? Because how many times you get to submit a petition? And so the big question for people trying to collect signatures for a petition is, especially with our language about fair affiliation and how legible the signatures are, is how you know when you have enough. How do you certify the signatures that you have so you know you've had enough? And I think that whole process needs to be visited more carefully, maybe provide people some means by which they can tell if they've met the bar or not before they submit their petition would help.
Thank you. AJ?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge I am speaking a lot. And part of that is I am the board president. And so a lot of these things are affecting, will affect our processes going forward. And I just want to make sure that there's not there's not significant changes that will affect us negatively. So again, I would ask the question to this is, what problem is it fixing? Or what problem is there with how we've been doing it? And then not to pick on you at all, Stephen, but I keep hearing you relate to state statutes and things like that. And I want to recognize while that we're different and that we are unique in how we do our processes. And so I'd hate for us to start, creating a bylaw change based on those state statutes and everything like that. Because that's just not who we are, I don't believe. I believe the process that took place last year, there was other significant issues that created that problem that I think we could address, but I don't think limiting the time was a significant issue that made that a problem last year.
I put my own hand up because I just wanted to point out that in the election procedures, we do give a deadline for when advisory petitions are due in order to get them on the ballot during the annual meeting. And that has been our practice, to have a deadline for when petitions are there for the annual meeting. And then what happens if it's if it's not an advisory petition, it was really expensive to have a separate vote outside of the annual meeting. So that might be one problem that it solves if there is a limit, a time limit. John Steinhardt.
Well, first of all, could you let me speak before AJ so that he can agree with me for a while instead of me agreeing with him?
You got to get your hand up there faster.
So I'm not aware of, in all my, about 35 years of volunteering, of more than a handful of petitions. So I'm not really sure which problem this is solving. The one concern I have is that if we do set a time limit, I think it has to be fairly lengthy, because a pretty good chunk of our community, primarily the artisans, are really out of touch most of the year. They're really, it actually makes it important if somebody is serious about a petition to gather signatures at the event, because these people are on the road a good part of the time. It's how they earn their living, and they're just not reachable any other time of year. So I don't want to make a time period that's short enough that things are going to fail by default.
Thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, first of all, to address what AJ said, I do refer to our state laws and our state practices fairly frequently, because those are systems that are well established and work. I know that they are not us, we are different, but I'm looking at some issues that we have, and this cost us some money last year, and took a fair amount of my time trying to figure out what to do if a petition that I knew was coming in did not have enough signatures on it. Would I just be able to say this petition has failed, you did not have enough signatures, or would I have to take some other action? So this is an actual problem that almost occurred last year. And that's why I wanted to address this. I'm not suggesting a really short time period for turning in petitions. It was asked, how to give people feedback. The mechanism that the state uses is to have them turn them in every 30 days and tell them how many valid signatures they have and how many they need to go. Something like that could work for us if people wanted to know when they're circulating petitions, how many valid signatures they have gathered. And I can tell you that when I received the petition last year, a much lower percentage of the signatures were able to be validated than I expected. And I expected a reasonably low number. It was much lower than that. And I think, in fairness to petitioners, being able to report those numbers to them and giving them an opportunity to submit more petitions might be the right thing for us to do. But leaving it completely open-ended, somebody could try to start circulating a petition to remove a director, and 4 years later have gathered enough signatures, even though that director has already left their term of office. And we would, at that point, have a valid petition to remove them. I don't think that's reasonable. I think there should be some sort of limits on it. They could be fairly long limits. It could be a year. Whatever it is. This is not something we're addressing in this current set of proposed bylaw changes, but certainly worth talking about down the road. So I do think there is a real problem here. And generally you either say you have one shot, you have X amount of time to turn in petitions, which is what we do on advisory petitions. You have until July 31st to turn in an advisory petition. If you have enough signatures by July 31st, it goes on the ballot. If you don't, it doesn't. This is the same kind of thing for removal petitions, except for we don't have a deadline because we can't do a removal action at our annual election because of statutes that require that to be a separate meeting of the membership or a separate election. So removal action petitions could happen any time of the year. So again, I think at some point we need to address this. I don't think it's something we need to address immediately. Thanks.
John Alexander.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. With AJ and John Steinhardt that any policy or bylaws changes should be addressing a problem, and I think that we need to frame each of these potential changes around a fix. But I also think that each time around we need to ask ourselves, why are we different, and how is that serving us? Because we get a lot of, well, this is the way we've always done things, and a lot of the stuff isn't written down, and I see stuff that we're gonna go with this approach because it's precedent. And while we're different, and I love the fact that we're different, we're also transitioning from being an operations board to a policy board, and that's still new, and we're still feeling those growing pains. So I think that the whole, this is the way we've done things, I think we always need to ask ourselves, how is that serving us? And so I think our decisions should be based on research and consider other systems that are in place and have been proven to work. I've taken organizations' bylaws and cookie cutted them to create new organizations because those bylaws were clean, tight, and they worked really well. So whether we borrow from other organizations that have already made this transition fully to operations, or whether we take them from governments or wherever we take them, let's not blindly take them. Let's make sure that they're systems that work. But I thank Stephen for bringing us things that have worked as opposed to just making stuff up.
Thank you. Teresa?
Wow. I've gone back and forth in my mind from what I was originally going to say, but I like the idea of an ending. I like boundaries. I don't like the idea that it could go on forever. I do agree with everyone that it being very generous would need to be very important. What John talked about was how often do people see each other, so that it isn't that the problem we're solving is something that goes on for 4 or 5 years, not something that took 2 years to get there. Because I do think there is something about something being timely. Like, I signed this, let's say I signed something this year, and 4 years later, things have changed and I've changed my mind, and you're still putting my name on something when there's so many different things there. Like, as a signer, I would like to know that this has an ending moment. So I do think whether it's bylaws or policies, I don't have a good enough handle on that. I appreciate the comments that it's that it might be a bylaw change. And I also would like to concur with what John Alexander said, that I really appreciate hearing the way the research that happens and hearing the way the state of Oregon does it or something like that, because it provides me context. But I also really agree with AJ that we're different. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Kevin?
Yeah, I wanted to agree too as well with Teresa about I'm not comfortable with anything without limits. That feels it feels weird. Feels like it, could be taken advantage of to some sort, and also doesn't really, if there is a problem that folks want to solve or something they want to do, they should it could provide opportunity for them to do it. So I think there should be some kind of limit, a nice length that we want or something like that. I think that makes sense. one thing I was thinking about is like, with like the removal action that happened, question I had during it was, if it doesn't work, can they just put another petition right back in there? And so I think that's something that's not addressed either. I'm not sure what that looks like, but could make you think that folks could just continually do this. And I don't know if there should be a limit on that or not, as far as the people have spoken, they don't want said person removed or whatever happened. Should they just be ignored? And so that's my question. I don't know if Stephen, if you have anything for that. Thanks for your hard work. This is great.
Thank you. Paxton?
I'd like to mention that most of petitions that we've done, that members have done, they gather signatures at the picnic because there's usually enough people there that to sign the petition to get through. And I think this is a pretty common method. You can easily get more than 100 signatures at the picnic if you've got something really popular. I actually do like not an open-ended, but a deadline. And I think, on our board election, I mean, the advisory ballots, we do have a deadline on it. And so that makes me think of, do we need to define a starting period? And I think that, once something started circulating, I think, setting a limit of 3 or 4 months to deal with it as signature collecting is very appropriate. Because that kind of stops the open-ended. And maybe if somebody just files a petition with the fair office, then that activates something that gives them a certain time limit, to get their signatures. Other than and 3 or 4 months is fine by me. 2 or 3 months is probably adequate, but again, our people are hard to get to find. So I would go for 3 or 4 months. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Stephen?
Yeah, regarding the mechanism, my thinking on this was that if somebody wants to circulate a petition, they should submit the language of the petition to the secretary to make sure that it conforms with our code of conduct. Not for the secretary to decide whether they like the petition or not, but whether it's conformant to our code of conduct and whether it's legal. For example, for the removal action, I had to advise the petitioners on several occasions of the exact language they needed to use to make that a legal petition. And I told them that if they use different language, that I would be required to reject it. Not because I want to reject it, but because the law requires the wording to be a certain way. So my thinking was, and we hadn't developed any policy proposals yet, was that they would first submit the petition language to the secretary to make sure everything is legal and according to our code of conduct, and that's when the process would begin. I have no thoughts on how long the process should take at this point. I'm not saying 3 months or a year or 5 years. I just think something needs to be done. And to address Kevin's comments, he asked what happens if a petition fails or if there's a removal action that fails, if they can go right back and do it again. I'm like, look at California and look at Oregon. We have recalls for our governors almost every single year. Fortunately, in Oregon, they always fail to gather enough signatures, but in California, they've had several recall elections for governors that always fail, almost always fail. I think they had one that passed several years ago. There's nothing that can stop people from circulating a petition to do the same thing again if they failed the first time. I don't know that we want to put any limits on that or not, but that's not what this proposal would be at all. To me, that's a completely separate issue. This is just if a petition is submitted, should there be a time frame or should there not? That's it. Thanks.
AJ.
I just had a question. What is the longest that you've had a petition in our history? Have we ever had a petition that goes past 1 year or 2 years?
Well, In my history, no.
In my history, I'm not.
How about Heidi?
In my history, we primarily had advisory petitions, which had a deadline.
Mm.
And we didn't have to have a separate meeting for a removal action.
Yeah, so that is my point exactly, is that I know we're having this broad discussion and we're bringing in things like 4 and 5 years. And I think that may scare some people, and that may mislead some people into thinking that we've gotten close to that, or that has been even a threat. And that it just hasn't. And so I really want to get us back to what are the actual facts. The actual facts are, and I've studied this because I was paying attention, is we haven't had one. We haven't had one that went that long. We just haven't. And so are we fixing something that's reality? Are we fixing something, we're putting something in place because we want to? I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense that we haven't had it as a problem that has gone more than a year of a petition. But yet we're talking about it as if we have. And so that's my concern.
Okay, and I was hoping to close it, but Heather, go ahead.
Well, I'm always fast. I would say that it's much easier for everyone to have some structure. And even though there's no reason to not solve problems before we have them. So if the last removal issue brought up potentialities, we can learn from those rather than waiting until having the actual problem. It's like putting in a stoplight at an intersection after someone dies. So I think that it makes sense and will be much easier for signature gatherers if there is a structure. And I would highly lobby for you turn in the signatures that you have every 30 days and someone lets you know how many are good. That should definitely be part of it. That would be so much easier for people. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, is it okay if we go ahead and move on to the actual proposed bylaws?
Yeah, actually, that's kind of what I was going to say. This proposal here is the thing that we're intending to kick down the road, either to kick it to the elections committee to discuss later, or to just put it on hold indefinitely. And I think we should stop talking about the time limits on petitions, because that's not going to be in the proposals for the board next month. So yeah, let's start working on the bylaws.
And so the next thing would be for the board to decide if they want it to be in the bylaws, or do they want us to make a policy about it at some point in the future. So my question is, should I go ahead and show the entire bylaws, Stephen, with the lawyer comments? So
yeah, if you want, I was going to comment on. I've had a chance to read through our attorney's comments again during this meeting, and the only thing she's really addressing is the first proposal. She's pretty much just accepted everything else and said that doesn't mean she's recommending we do it, but she's saying everything else as written is straightforward and legal. A couple of minor typos and grammatical errors that she wanted to fix, but she was mainly addressing the first proposal. So almost everything that she offered was regarding the first proposal. And I don't know if you want to go through the proposed motions or you just want to go through the bylaws as a whole. It seems like there's some disagreement on whether some of these motions might pass or not. So maybe discussing them separately, the bylaw changes separately, might make a little more sense.
Okay. The more I think about it, I agree. There's a question here in the chat about fire awareness, and I would just say that this is not the topic of this work session, but maybe board members want to take note of that comment. Or maybe Kirsten has the answer to that comment. So I'm going to share the motions. Just have to remember how to share again. And so these are the proposed motions that will need board support. Stephen has really crafted these in lots of whereases that are part of the rationale. So the first one about changing the method of selecting directors to written ballot, that's going to change to written ballot. Whereas the fair began as a small group who met in person regularly to discuss policy and elect directors at an annual meeting of the membership. And whereas the fair membership has grown to the point that virtually all ballots for directors are cast remotely by proxy. And whereas there is no mention of certification of the election in the Oregon Nonprofit Corporation Act or the fair's bylaws. And whereas that by tradition, the membership secretary and treasurers informally certify the election after the ballots have been counted. So is this one actually puts the certification with the written ballot.
Correct.
Because the it affects similar parts of the bylaws.
It doesn't address terms of office, just that the election will be formally certified.
Right. And whereas the bylaws should reflect actual practice as closely as feasible, the board therefore resolves to change the method of selecting directors to election by direct ballot, written ballot, and to clarify the election certification process and amends the bylaws to effect these changes as follows. The green is what is in the bylaws now, and the red is the recommended changes. So change it from membership meetings to membership actions. The annual meeting would introduce board candidates rather than electing them.
We are also changing the date, the date to October 15th instead of October 30th, so that we have a chance for an election afterwards.
Right. Time to turn in ballots, basically. And this part about the advisory resolutions is removed from this section and put somewhere else, which is in number 2 here. Adding number 2 to have annual elections, which is basically meaning we'd have a meeting to introduce the candidates. The election happens when all the ballots are turned in or at the ballot deadline and we count the ballots. This is where the advisory resolutions, when those petitions would have to be turned in. And it also, that would change special meetings to number 3. Adds information about in the case that the purpose of a special meeting is limited to a vote on the removal of a director or directors, advisory petitions and or ratifying bylaw changes. The membership secretary shall conduct an election by direct ballot. It'll say written ballot. Changing it just from membership meetings and annual elections to also annual elections. Changing it from absentee ballot to proxy because that is the state language. So actually, we still would be voting by proxy. Is my understanding.
We would not be voting by proxy, but we would allow proxy votes.
Oh, I see. Okay. Right now, the ballots say that the secretary is the proxy for everybody who turns in a written ballot. And adding the wording annual election. And see, this is where I'm interested to see what the lawyer said about absentee ballots versus proxies. Because the state language doesn't say absentee ballots, it talks about proxies.
Yeah, I have to review that part of her email again, because she did mention that.
Yeah. It also would affect Article 7, Section 4, changing membership meeting to election. Article 8, Section 1, changing membership meeting to election. Article 9, Section 3B, about certifying them, the results. And as our practice has always been, that the treasurer has helped with the ballot counting. So membership input on that. I see that Stephen Berkson has a hand up.
Hi, and I want to start saying I'm sorry I couldn't make the prior meetings of these committees. And I am very much in favor of change because the language that we have had around our elections has not really comported with our practice. And there are a number of problems with our existing conduct where the election is already complete before the annual meeting is ever held. That said, I think there are some, I think it would be wise to take more time. And if you pass something of this structure that doesn't really change what we do anyway, but just adds clarity to the language in August, you could even implement it this year. And it doesn't have to be implemented this year necessarily. But the important thing is that everyone gets a chance to digest it and be comfortable with it. That said, there is an inconsistency here where you say that the annual meeting, that the purpose of the annual meeting is to introduce the board candidates to membership. And then as part of the quorum, if you don't have 200 physically present people, you will have instead, you will count people who have already voted. And my recommendation, there's some other problems here. I'm not going to have time apparently to voice them, but I would say my recommendation is to, because the annual meeting is not where the decision is being made. And I had a lot of involvement in the WOW Hall in talking to lawyers about this proxy thing. I don't know what I missed at the beginning of the meeting, but move the annual meeting and call it the beginning of the process. Kick off the election with the annual meeting. The annual meeting constitutes the close of nominations and is more of reports and a candidate forum. And then people have 1 month to vote after the annual meeting. And as far as the other deadlines that have been set around voter booth pamphlets and other things, that is, and this is what we said at the WOW Hall, the benefit of declaring early is that you get printed in there. So if you declare early, you get the free publicity from the system. If you don't declare early and get nominated from the floor at the meeting, you would still be printed on the ballot now, and the election would take place after the meeting. There is no requirement, if you write your own procedure, there is no requirement for the election to have to be held at the annual meeting. There's no reason that you can't do this process, and in fact, that's what we've been doing at the WOW Hall now. So my advice is to reframe things, move the annual meeting to the beginning, call that the close of nominations, which is something that's also been kind of fuzzy, and then actually have everyone who's nominated for the position be able to be on the ballot while still preserving you need to declare early to get printed up in the pamphlet. Thanks.
Thank you. John Pincus.
Well, I have to agree with some of the things that Stephen just said. I think I was kind of puzzled by the changing of the words that say that denote the annual meeting or the special meeting, whichever it is, and changing that to the election. I think the meeting is a meeting and it's more than just an election. It encompasses a lot of information sharing, and in certain circumstances, it may encompass some very important input from the membership as to various processes. But I think the idea of having the meeting kick off the election is a good one. But I wouldn't want to foreclose additional candidates from that point. So some logistics to work out there, but the general concept of having the meeting precede the election is a good idea, because information is shared at the annual meeting that may affect people's choices in voting. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there's some confusion here, because I kind of see this as the meeting does come before the election. The due date for ballots would be after this annual meeting. And if I agree about it would be the last chance to nominate for the board, but we've already had ballots printed way before this meeting would happen, and so they wouldn't be on the ballot, but they could be a write-in, is how it's always been. For years, that's how it's always been. If someone is nominated at the meeting, they're not going to be on the ballot. They would be a write-in. And I will pass it over to Stephen real quick and make my phone be quiet.
Yeah, so we actually don't have a process of nominating people for our board elections. People declare their candidacy, and they declare in August. They declare well before the annual meeting. And one thing I want to be really clear about, because I think there's a little misunderstanding about this, we have an annual meeting of the membership in October. And that is where the reports are given and the board candidates are introduced, and where traditionally we have elected our directors. Then we have an annual meeting of the board of directors, which takes place in November. So we have two separate annual meetings approximately a month apart. And we're talking about the annual meeting of the membership here. At this point, we're not proposing making major changes to our election system. We would want to have the annual meeting of the membership sometime in August. Probably we would want to have some formal nominating process in order to make those kinds of changes that are being suggested. What we're doing here is just saying we're reflecting the reality that most people do not attend the annual meeting in person anymore. And we are having a separate election by written ballot where the ballots are due after the annual meeting, to give those people who are not able to attend the annual meeting in person an opportunity to cast their ballots based on the information that is shared at the annual meeting. If we don't make this change, we really should be requiring the ballots, the proxy ballots that we're currently receiving, we should require them to be due at the annual meeting, which would not give remote members an opportunity to vote. We started accepting all the ballots by proxy during the pandemic, and then I found out from our attorney that our practice that we established of having the annual online meeting and accepting the ballots later is something that we shouldn't be doing, that we actually do need to require the ballots to be returned, all the proxy ballots to be returned at the end of the annual meeting. So what this proposed set of changes does is actually gives the remote members more opportunity to vote than if we kept the current system of electing our directors at our annual meeting. I'm not opposed to looking at the whole electoral process and perhaps having the annual meeting be sometime earlier and have a formal nominating process. But right now, I'm just trying to make what we're actually doing 100% legal and to allow us to move forward with online voting should we ever want to get to that point. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa.
So, I know you said, Stephen Berkson, sorry, a bunch of Stephens here, that you had a few other issues, and we are meeting in a week, and I would, love to hear what those are. So I'm going to send you my email, but if you feel like doing it, but I'm very interested in hearing what those are that we can take to this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
So I feel like I am totally handicapped here because there's all this use of the word proxy that makes no sense. And apparently there's a bunch of reference to the attorney saying why it's proxy. But the two definitions of proxy are, one, the authority to represent someone else, especially in voting. It makes no sense to me that I'm not representing myself when I send in my ballot. The other definition that comes right up is a person holding authority to act for another. So I would beg you to please share with us what the attorney had to say about proxy and why we have the word proxy in here. It's incredibly confusing and seems utterly inappropriate. So I'd like to reserve some time for after I know why we're using proxy.
I'll give you my answer and then Stephen can maybe add to that. The state statutes do not refer to absentee ballots at all. So when the absentee ballots were first put into the bylaws, it designated the secretary as the proxy for all of the written ballots, all of the absentee ballots. And so that's my understanding of proxies. Stephen, maybe you can clarify, and your next hand up anyway.
Yeah, that's essentially correct. The way our bylaws are currently written, we cannot accept direct ballots from members. If you wish to mail in a ballot, if you read the back of your ballot, the back of your ballot will say that by signing your return envelope, you are appointing the secretary of the fair to cast your ballot for you as your proxy. And that is in order for us to comply with Oregon statutes. The change that we're proposing now to have an election by direct written ballot means that your ballot is your vote. And I am not going to be casting your vote for you. Last fall, I cast 1,300 ballots for people as their proxy, because that's the only mechanism we have other than if you show up to the annual meeting and cast your ballot in person at the annual meeting. And we did not issue a single ballot to a person at our last annual meeting. I think 5 or 6 ballots were deposited in the ballot box at the meeting, but those were ballots that had already been issued to people and were proxies. The year before, I believe we issued 1 ballot, maybe 2 ballots. So virtually all of our ballots are being cast by proxy right now. And this proposal would eliminate that. This doesn't make fundamental changes to our entire electoral process, but it eliminates the proxy voting. Although that mechanism is still there for people who are unable to return their ballots, they can still appoint the secretary as their proxy. But as I said earlier, I think that I will be casting 5 or 6 proxy ballots this fall if these changes take effect instead of 1,300 or 2,000, however many people vote. So this is not a major change. This is reflecting what we do. We can talk about other changes, I think, later, and those might be changes that we want to mull on for a year or so before we recommend making any substantial changes to our process. But this is just reflecting what we do in a more straightforward way, and again allows us to eventually do online voting if that's what we want to do. Thanks.
John Alexander.
Yeah, thank you. And Stephen, thank you for doing that for all of us. That's awesome. I even know people who show up at the meeting with their ballot in their hand, all excited to put it in the box, but then the meeting gets so excited they forget to drop it in the box. But I'm wondering whether with this new database that we have, we could go to an alternative. It wouldn't preclude us from doing mail-in ballots or proxies or whatever we call them, but could we do online voting? Is that even, or is that just a crazy idea? But that might solve some of these problems.
Legally, we can't. Well, legally we can, but every single person would have to send me a proxy authorization unless we change the bylaws.
Do it online, to do like you log in and you cast your vote and you.
Yeah, you'd have to fill out a piece of paper appointing me as your proxy, and then you'd have to mail that to me. And then you would have to cast a provisional vote online, and I would have to do the final casting of the vote for you. That's legally how we would have to do it with our current bylaws. If we enact these changes, we don't have to do any of that.
Because I'm just trying to think of a simple way of where you can go to the annual meeting virtually and then cast your vote. But okay, thank you.
Hopefully we'll be able to someday.
Paxton, or wait, John Steinhardt and then Paxton.
Yeah, just since I sort of heard my name called out there, we're a few years away from doing that if we want to. We have higher priorities to get running, which is why I'm writing software while listening to you guys. I think what's getting lost here is changing the proxy language is just a technical fix, and we seem like we're really hung up on that. But I support that particular change because, you know, as has been said many times, you know, it's just changing the bylaws to reflect our actual behavior and making it easier for ourselves, and is really independent of all of the other issues that are being brought up. Thanks.
Thank you. Paxton?
I was involved in the original discussion when we set up proxies, and it was equally confusing then. But it was done, you know, under Russell, our attorney at the time, who was Fair Family, really knew how the fair worked, and really wrote it to follow state rules. And I do know that state rules have somewhat changed since then, so I really kind of support moving away from the proxy mode. I personally would also like to get the online voting in the long run, so I favor this change. Thank you.
Stephen?
Yeah, I just want to clarify what Paxton just said. At the time that this proxy mechanism was enacted, this was the only legal way to do it. Statute has changed since then. It's just changed in the last couple of years. In fact, our attorney had to spend a fair amount of time researching how we could do the removal action by written ballot versus doing the proxy stuff that we've been doing for our annual elections. The statute was new enough that she had to do a fair amount of research before she found a way to do that. So this is a new mechanism for us to get rid of this awkward proxy language, and it is just a technical cleanup. I don't want to get a whole lot of major changes to the way we conduct our elections involved until we get things in our bylaws technically to conform with the way we're doing it now. Then we can look at other changes later. Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna move us on because we have 13 minutes left. And the next one, like I said, that one had lots of changes. The next one was establishing a minimum age, and we already discussed a little bit about whether or not we want it to be 16. And it only affects Article 5, Section 2A. Just adding an age in there into the eligibility piece. And 2D, we said you have to submit your registration form at least 30 days before a membership meeting. So if you turn 16 before, or whatever age we choose, before the membership meeting, then you would still be eligible, but you could turn it in while you were still 15 or whatever age we choose. And the change here to Article 5, Section 6A just takes out the part about 30 days because we put it into a new section. And we're not sure, we're still looking for legal advice. Anytime a change to Article 5, 6A happens that affects membership rights, voting rights, it has to be ratified, approved by the membership. But at this point, the legal advice is that it doesn't affect their membership rights. And maybe LT wants to weigh in on that one. Paxton, do you still have your hand up? I didn't think so. So I think that one's pretty self-explanatory, that's where that change would go when we decide what we want it to be. AJ? Did we lose AJ?
Sorry, I was on mute. I don't know if you guys have thought about this at all, but what is the mechanism in which you will account for somebody's age under the age of 18?
Right now, the membership form asks for a birth date.
Okay.
And
They also have to
they
provide that.
trust-
They also have to provide their date of birth when they get their wristband, and I will have access to the date of birth in the inventory database, so I can confirm that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Motion 3 about clarifying the effective beginning of terms. We may not have time to discuss this and look at the others. There's the whereases and the motion. It would affect Article 7, Section 2E about the term, and it just adds a line saying this is when the term of office of newly elected directors shall be effective upon ratification of the election results at the annual board meeting, if that's what the board chose to do. If we wanted to, the motion 3A is an alternate amendment. Say where, with all the whereases, if this one would be that when the election is certified. And so that's where the committee did not necessarily agree and does not want to make the decision for the board, which way they want to go with that. Motion 4 is about changing the voting participation requirement. This is where it said annual, we would just cross out annual. Add meeting or election. Motion 5 is about changing the petition signature requirement, should the board choose to do that, from a hard number to a percentage. This piece about advisory resolutions gets added to annual elections. And 8% goes in Article 6, Section 3. If the first motion, motion number 1, the very first one, is defeated, this is the alternate language here. Because some of the other things would not have changed. And so, are any comments about the bylaw changes? We will be meeting, like we said before, the bylaw elections committee will be meeting next Monday night. We welcome people to come to the meeting if they want to offer suggestions or questions. We also welcome emails if you want to write it out for us. The email is elections@OregonCountryFair.net. You could send us feedback that way.
Heidi,
Yes.
it's elections@OregonCountryFair.org.
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I've been looking at the .net site. You're right, it's .org. And these proposed motions are in the board working documents also, correct? I see Kirsten nodding her head. I can see you now that I'm not sharing my screen.
They're both in the board working documents and on the joint elections bylaws committee page. So they're in 2 places on the .net site.
There you go. But our email is .org. So, any new hands for comments or questions? I have to go back all the way up to the top of the chat to see what we needed to do besides the president's piece. Was there anything else in the agenda?
Meeting evaluation.
Oh,
And
thank
next-
you.
And next board meeting.
Okay, I'll say right now that the next board meeting is April 1st, 7 p.m. The next bylaws elections committee meeting is next Monday, which is the 24th. And you can find that on the .net site. So, comments about the meeting, I need to go all the way back down. And AJ's got a hand vote.
Though I'm not going to do a president's piece after this, so that should shorten it a little bit. The thing I wanted to say, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot we went over here tonight. And I don't think we've got the full picture of what, how that sits with what the attorney sent back, because that is fresh with you guys as well. I'm curious, at your next meeting, will you have all of that feedback embedded in what you showed us tonight by that time? Or how do you plan on comparing the 2 documents of what we learned tonight versus what their feedback is? I thought it was a good meeting. I think these are serious topics when it comes to our organization and how we're going to function in the next 10 years, 5 years, and 10 years. But I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the participation, and thank you.
Thank you. Stephen will correct me if I'm wrong, but we will be comparing. My understanding is, and in just briefly looking at the comments from the lawyer, there aren't going to be any huge substantial changes. But we're going to agree on that language at our next meeting on Monday. And then these will be presented not at the April meeting, but at the May meeting as new business. So that will give us also time to get the final language up. And then hopefully voted on at the June meeting. Okay, Stephen, you're the first hand.
Okay, so yeah, I appreciate everybody's input tonight. There is a lot here. Most of these are fairly technical changes, but there is a lot that's going on here. This is stuff I've been thinking about and working on for a couple of years now, and I appreciate all the interest folks have shown in it and all their feedback. And I can pretty much confirm what Heidi just said. There are really no substantive changes from the attorney's review, and almost all of her changes were just in the first proposal, and they were just wording changes to make us more compliant with statute. She believes that we should always write our bylaws using the same words as are used in statute as much as possible, so that it's easy to see how our bylaws correlate to statutes. And that's the major changes she made. On topics 2 through 5, virtually nothing from her. But yes, our plan is next week is to incorporate her changes. I've already sent her changes to the entire committee, so we'll have a week to review it. And I just want to remind folks that are still thinking that maybe this is a little bit rushed. We've been talking about this for several months. I started talking about it openly with the board last fall when we got the motion to create this ad hoc committee passed. And we've been publishing documents since the beginning of the year. So I think by June, there will be plenty of exposure of this stuff. I think the board should be ready to vote on some of these issues by then. Thanks.
John Alexander.
Yeah, I just want to say this is really great. We're in meeting, Val, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that I'm just remained super impressed by our committees. You guys have just done a wonderful job, well researched, very well run meeting, even keeled discussion. I appreciate that so much. I hope that if any of these things that we're talking about, and I don't know if this age thing is going to come up when you just mentioned that chain of events that's going to occur, that we at least maybe pull a couple of these things out and allow us to hear from the membership and discuss it as a board in public before we vote on that during new business, even if we just take a couple pieces of it, like the age piece. I think people are going to be interested in that, and hopefully we'll have time to hear them and not just make a vote after we hear them. And I also just want to encourage us, and I think this really was a great meeting, but to remember what's fact and what's opinion when we're talking about whether things make sense or don't make sense or whatever they are. These are a lot of subjective things that we're working on, and really take care not to take each other's words out of context, and really try to use our words well and listen to what people are saying, so we're not having to clarify ourselves and say, well, that's not really what I said. But all in all, I just would like us to keep working on that. But I think that this was a wonderful meeting, and I really appreciate how well prepared and how you all came and how well you ran this meeting. And sorry for being a little bit late.
Thank you. Anybody else have any comments on the meeting? For the meeting evaluation? Well, I appreciate you all putting up with me. I gotta say that I'm really tired. And I was talking to Stephen right before trying to, figure out the best way to go about this. So I'm sorry if I made some mistakes, but I think I did call on everybody eventually. So thank you all for your kind attention. I'll give you the elections email, elections@OregonCountryFair.org if you want to send us written comments. And the meeting is next Monday. And I also want to say that I really like the idea of, especially the age thing. If you have time at the next board meeting, if you could have a little bit of member input on that piece anyway, when it's new business, you're not going to decide anything, but throw it out there. And Stephen has his hand up.
Yeah, I want to, speaking of the age thing, I want to remind folks once again, we'll discuss next week some way of incorporating anybody who's on a teen crew as potentially being eligible voters, as well as just setting a straight age of 16. So we'll try to figure out how to craft some language and hopefully present two options to the board to discuss for that. Thanks.
Oh, and on that, I hope you saw the thing in the chat from Jen Lynn, mentioning that if we just say teen crew, that would leave out teens that work in booths. So there's maybe some thought there that we want to be able to include all teens who work, not just the ones on teen crew. And Teresa.
I just also wanted to remember the comment from Paul, who was here briefly about the fire safety, and I'm not sure how that gets responded to. He left after doing it, as far as I can tell, but I just want to keep in mind that little tiny piece. And a big thank you to everybody here with such great input and ideas.
Do we want a fire response answer?
Will you please contact Paul Fuller?
I will if I can get his contact info, because that just got thrown out there. But then once the question's out, it seems like a lot of people have concerns about it. And the answer is yes and no. There's an evacuation process for the fair in a large scale incident. But when we look at booths for our safety inspections, which we do, and which we're upgrading we've been upgrading the last couple of years in our intensity on inspecting booths, we look at their individual egress plans, their individual booth egress capability. And if they have a fire in their booth, all we're concerned about is that they can get out. Once they get out, run away from the fire. There's no evacuation plan because you can't draw individual maps for every campground and every tent and every little space. So all we do is look and see that they can get out of those booths if something happens, like no propane bottles under the stairs to the loft, no fencing in all the egress so you only have one little door to get out and then having a fire pit in the middle, things like that. That's what we look at to make sure people can get out of their booths and then just run away from the fire.
Okay, Stephen, thank you. And Heather, thank you for that note. It really threw me to see Paul Fuller's name there because I knew Paul passed last year. So it was actually Judy who was asking that, Judy Fuller. And John Steinhardt, you're the last hand because we are stopping at 9 o'clock on the dot.
Yes, great meeting. Thank you. I did want to actually comment on your last comment, which is possibly we need to think a little bit more about our overall policy for what type of wristbands people get, because the fact that booth people just get wristbands and there's no separation of actual booth people versus who's essentially an SOP on a booth wristband is a similar issue that, kind of led to us saying anybody with a wristband is eligible for an elder, because we didn't want to treat people differently, but the way we treat the staff is completely different than the way we treat the booths. And maybe we should think about coming up with a way to treat everybody more equitably, and that might address a whole bunch of those problems. But that's really not for this group. It's a whole nother thing. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody. Thanks for
Thank you all.
attending.
Good
Meeting.
meeting.
Good night, everybody.
Thank y'all.